We live in a fantasy world now. Reality has been destroyed.
This is the time that we really need to pay attention.
The probabilities are overwhelmingly on gold's side. That is the best environment to see gold increase its value.
Welcome to Palisade's Gold Radio. I'm your host, Tom Wojcicki. Joining me today is Dr. Judy Shelton, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute, also the author of 3 books, including the recently released Good as Gold, How to Unleash the Power of Sound Money. Dr. Judy Shelton, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure, Tom. Thanks for asking me.
So I've been looking forward to this interview for quite a while now. And as I just mentioned, the book just came out probably about 8 or 10 days ago now. So I wanted to start by asking you, why is the idea of sound money actually a moral issue?
Well, I would start by saying we have legal tender laws in this country. So we have to use the currency that is our nation's currency. And to me, that means it's incumbent on government to provide a sound money unit. And I don't think you can have sound money without sound finances. So I look upon it as a moral contract between the government and its citizens that the money perform the way it's meant to, including going back to our Constitution. I think Article 1, Section 8 describes regulating the money in the same way as you would establish official weights and measures, with the idea that money is supposed to be an unvarying standard. It's supposed to be a measure, and in that sense, a tool, so people can plan their lives and decide whether to save or invest or consume or produce. And so I feel that the moral underpinning for an economy devoted to free market mechanisms and entrepreneurial innovation, they really have to deliver money that is dependable, that performs as a meaningful unit of account and a reliable store of value.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like using the difference, let's say, in the terms of money and currency, and let's say highlighting especially the idea of money holding value over time, and really with the understanding, obviously, of the inflation and the degradation of the purchasing power, do you think that's a really important distinction to make?
I do. I think the way you worded it makes a lot of sense to me because, for instance, you see people who now might be buying gold, whether they're getting it at Costco or wherever, mm-hmm. but as kind of a store of wealth. And it doesn't mean that the gold is necessarily going to increase in value, although I think that's the trend, and it's reasonable to expect it would. But if you buy an ounce of gold today, in 10 years, you still own an ounce of gold. But if you hold currency, the value of money, when you're talking about the money supply, which is influenced by monetary policy carried out through the Federal Reserve, there is a built-in obsolescence factor. It is the Federal Reserve's policy to debase the money unit 2% a year. Mm-hmm. And they would pat themselves on the back if they did that. They haven't even hit their target for quite a while. But I think it's an important distinction that they intend for money to lose its purchasing power from year to year. So the dollar you have today is not worth $1 in the future. So that's why it is an important distinction and why we need to even flesh out our definition of sound money, or as the Fed would say, stable prices, when what they really mean is stable inflation.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was part of a board meeting one time, and I had asked one of the economic advisors that was kind of doing this against gold argument, what the goal of having a 2% inflation rate was, and if that was, okay with him, that their goal was to destroy 2% of our purchasing power per year. his answer was that it just gives them the leeway to be able to basically heat up or turn down the economy. And I didn't think that was that was a good answer, because his answer was based around the economy and not what it actually does to our purchasing power.
That's interesting. That's one of the three answers you're likely to get. Mm-hmm. And I even start from the point of view, what if you said the target should be zero inflation? I mean, that's what most people would think one means when you say stable prices, zero inflation. That's what Alan Greenspan thought it meant. Mm-hmm. There's a great set of transcripts from July 1996, when Greenspan was chairman of the Fed, Janet Yellen was a governor. And around the table with the other members of the Federal Open Market Committee, they discussed, how do we interpret this part of our mandate that says we promote stable prices? And Greenspan thought it had to be zero. And at the time, it was running about 3%. But Janet Yellen made an argument, and she used this one. And it comes from Keynesian economics. It's money illusion. But the idea is basically, if you have 2% inflation, you could give someone a nominal increase in their salary of 1%, but you're still really cutting them by 1%. Mm-hmm. And that person would rather have a nominal increase, even though they're losing purchasing power, than if it were zero, getting a cut of 1%. So it's that idea. And she cited a survey where people said, well, if inflation were 2% and I got a 2% raise, I guess I'd be happy. Mm-hmm. But then it's interesting to read in the transcripts. She said, you'll all be happy to know that the same survey, when taken by economists, said they wouldn't be happy. Mm-hmm. And the transcript reflects laughter around the table. And to me, that's a sort of this arrogance that we know better, but your average worker wouldn't. Well, I think we see from union negotiations, that's not true. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that people should have to go through the inconvenience of pestering their employer every year for a cost of living increase. And we know that some people get it, some people don't. So I don't think that's a reasonable way for the Fed to run monetary policy. The second reason they go for the target is the one that you cited, and it's the idea it gives them more policy space. Mm-hmm. So if the real interest rate is, say, 2.5%, which historically it is, but you can add 2% inflation to that on purpose, then they can have a policy target rate, what we used to call the Fed funds rate, of 4.5%. And now if we need stimulus, they can cut it to zero. Mm-hmm. Well, I think now the jury should be out in going back and analyzing what happens when the Fed cuts to zero. Does that really stimulate the economy? Or does it end up just sort of canceling out any potentially productive project, which necessarily has an element of risk? Mm-hmm. Well, if interest rates are zero, no one's going to take on a risky project. I think it ends up cutting off investment in the real economy and introducing price distortions on financial assets that then plague us for years after the Fed goes to zero rates, and then a very uncertain period when the Fed starts raising again. So it's the idea that the Fed ratcheting interest rates up and down is somehow beneficial. I don't think so. So I don't go for the policy space argument. The final answer you hear, why 2%? Although I should say, oftentimes I've heard even members of the Board of Governors say, well, because everyone does that around the world. It started with the New Zealand Central Bank, and now everyone does it. So as if now the U.S. has to continue with that. But the third reason is fear of deflation. And that's really been set up as the bogeyman, I think. The deflation that's damaging that we see in, say, China is a symptom of a far more fundamental economic problem, which is the Chinese government trying to run the economy, trying to manage it, and building too much and feeding consumer demand through artificial means. And we see that under the classical international gold standard, and I often look at historical performance under different monetary systems, you could have periods of deflation that were really a reflection of increases in productivity due to technology and those advances. So the natural state, I think, is to have a slightly deflationary bias. And so actually, if the Fed targeted zero, you would still have mild stimulus, because I think we see the prices of everything from cell phones, laptops, but lots of items through more efficient means of producing them. You have a declining cost for higher quality, and those are great benefits to a capitalist society. And during the classical international gold standard, we often saw times where there was deflation in one sense, but you still had economic growth and you still had advances that were raising the standard of living. So I think that is overdone, and people think that deflation is a horrible thing, but mild deflation, no. I think it's a positive thing, and I think it would be better if we just had people take their money straight and we had zero inflation, assuming the Fed really could hit that. I mean, if the Fed says they can go from 9% to 2%, why not just go down to zero? And then the rest of us wouldn't have to define everything in the future in terms of inflation adjusted prices. And we wouldn't have to pay taxes on capital gains that just reflect nominal increases due to inflation. I think it would be a much more efficient system, a much more accurate measure, and provide much more reliable price signals if we had zero inflation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting as you're, giving me this answer, and we always talk about, targeted inflation, whether that be 2%, whether it be 0%. But exactly as you kind of hit on at the end about this idea of asset price inflation as well. It's not necessarily just CPI or the price of goods. It's also asset inflation that, at different times in history was a great beneficiary, let's say, of this type of monetary policy. You mentioned Alan Greenspan and his interpretation during that time. One of my favorite parts in the book was this idea of Greenspan's admission that their models going into 2008 didn't properly account for human behavior. I pulled that out because it is, when we think of this powerful, all-knowing entity within most people that think that it's within the government, and there's an admission like that from one of the chairs or the head of the Fed at one point in time, at a very consequential point in history as well, that kind of, to me, shows maybe the hubris that exists within that institution at different times to be able to properly account for every different piece of the economy.
Well, I do think there's hubris, and even talking about the Federal Reserve as steering us to a soft landing. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Fed chairman should not be the pilot of the economy. Nobody is that smart. Mm-hmm. There's no natural omniscience, and it's a mistake to deify the top Fed official. I think we should pay much more attention to the organic aspects of the economy, the people within the economy, the producers and consumers, and the ones who supply and the ones who demand, and investors and savers versus the entrepreneurs who need the capital to take on new projects. That's the real economy. So monetary policy, to me, should have an element, some kind of link to the real economy. The danger you talked about in the financial asset inflation is that people could reasonably say that monetary favoritism rewards some members of a society at the expense of others. And I think it's dangerous to have people say, I don't have financial assets, so I'm not participating. Maybe you have people who just were being responsible and putting a little bit of money aside every week, putting it in the bank. Mm-hmm. And think when you have zero or near zero inflation or interest rates orchestrated by the Federal Reserve, you're really, I've used this expression, making suckers out of savers. It undermines one of the real virtues of capitalism, because here they're doing the right thing and getting zilch on their savings. And in the meantime, when you see monetary policy that seems to reward big government, big business, and big investors, no wonder people talk about inequality of wealth and of income. We see a huge growth in financial assets, and I'm happy at least that probably half of Americans through their retirement IRAs or other programs are getting some benefit from the run up in markets. But it really is quite unfair, mostly I think to younger people who see it becoming further and further away, this chance to own financial assets, to have a home, or to be able to have enough money left over to invest when they're just trying to keep up their wages with inflation, which is eating away at their purchasing power. Mm-hmm. So I think money has to work the same for everyone. And we can go back to that matter of money being a moral contract. I think part of the American approach is equal treatment under the law. And I think you could even argue that inflation that robs people of purchasing power is really a form of expropriation without due process. I mean, some people maybe don't feel comfortable investing money. Maybe they don't feel they have the sophistication. So what if they do want to take their dollars and put them under their mattress? Bernanke, when he was chairman, once made fun of that and said, well, the only people who are against a 2% inflation target are people who put money under their mattress. Well, why shouldn't they be able to take it out from the mattress 10 years later and not have 20% of the wealth represented by their earnings having been taken away through the deliberate policies of our nation's central bank? I don't think that's fair.
Mm-hmm. You know, it seems like we're running, in some ways, a combination of a free market with a free market system with the combination of a centrally planned governing body that issues the money or currency and makes these decisions. And you know, you've done a lot of analysis of the Soviet system, of the centrally planned economy, and when we get to this point where we have a combination of the two, I think you're giving up benefits one way or the other as well. I feel like any movement towards central planning of, you know, the price of money really isn't that useful to the rest of the economy. And we'll get into how that kind of works. But I'd like to go back a little bit, if we can, and ask you, what was the need in the first place to create the Federal Reserve?
Well, Tom, I want to get to the point you brought up about the anomaly of having central planning and establishing the interest rate in an economy that is dedicated to free market forces, because of all the prices that we should not fix in a capitalist society would be the cost of capital. And you're right, my early work when I was at the Hoover Institution at Stanford was to study the internal monetary and financial condition of the Soviet Union. So this was in the mid to late 80s. And what I saw there is you had an economy dominated by the government, managed by the government, and banks were really used just to channel capital back up to the government and then redispersed according to communist principles, which meant lots of enterprises were given credit when they were no longer producing anything anyone wanted. And there was no place for new endeavors to have access to capital. And it's really one thing we should have learned from watching the Soviet experiment and how it ended is that central planning doesn't work. So why is it that for this vitally important price in our economy, the price of loanable capital, we go back to imbuing in a small agency, although they're fairly powerful, but just really a dozen people deciding.
Maybe concentrated agency would be a better word for that.
Very concentrated in terms of power, prominence, and even political impact. Because if you can channel rewards to one segment of society versus another, you have power. So I think that makes them politically potentially dangerous. And that's why everyone talks so much about the politicization of the Fed. Well, if the Fed was more rules-based and wasn't dependent upon the wholly discretionary judgment of individuals, it would be less vulnerable to accusations of being influenced or politicized. But the people who talk the most about the independence of the Fed seem to be the ones most resistant to having any kind of rules-based approach to running monetary policy. So I would just say that we know central planning doesn't work. And I would like to, I also think a dangerous trend we're seeing is that banks, commercial banks, interact with the Federal Reserve and engage with the Federal Reserve by receiving interest on the cash accounts they're required to maintain at the Federal Reserve. And I think that we are turning commercial banks into utilities of the Federal Reserve, part of a government system. And again, I think back to that Soviet analysis I did. They become the backbone of government and they finance the government. And that's why I think we're seeing an incredible rise in the level of non-bank lending and private lending these days. Mortgages, not so much through banks now, but through private mortgage providers. And increasingly, small business is turning to private lending. And I think it's because banks spend most of their time now deciding whether they should just sit back and take a 5% interest on cash, doing nothing, sitting at the Fed. Basically, the Fed is saying for 5% return, let it just sit here. Keep it corralled at the Fed. Don't make loans to people out of your reserve balances. So the Fed is inducing banks not to make loans to their clients in the private sector. And if they see, here's some utterance by a Fed official that maybe they're going to lower that rate they pay. It's called the interest on reserve balances administered rate. That is the Fed's target rate. That's how they manage interest these days. A bank might just say, well, should I buy government debt instead? Should I be looking at 2 or 5 or 20-year treasuries? So they just toggle back and forth, but they're all loans to the government. And I think loans to the private sector are going down. And instead, even banks are making loans to these private lenders. And it seems a way to get around the regulations that the Fed imposes and a way for the Fed to stay on the straight and narrow with the Fed. But nevertheless, now the lending is taking place through private lenders, and probably for small business, that's imposing a higher cost of borrowing than they would otherwise have gotten. Large companies can put out commercial paper. They have other means of obtaining capital. But I think the old community bank providing loans to a guy who wants to expand his hardware store, that model has very much changed.
You know, Judy, you mentioned in there this politicization of the Fed. How is the Fed actually not independent from the government as they're supposed to be because of this interest expense and this price, their ability to price money?
Well, that's interesting because on the Federal Reserve's website, when they say, why are we an independent agency within government? They put that all in quotes. One reason they say is because we don't go to Congress for an appropriation. We're not dependent on the federal government for our budgeting needs. And for the whole beginning of the Fed, that was always true, because so long as they had a portfolio earning income, they could cover their own expenses And then they're required to give anything over that as remittances back to Treasury. Mm-hmm. But starting in September 2022, I believe, the Fed was paying so much interest on reserves to banks who keep cash at the Fed. They're required to keep that depository account, that master account at the Fed, and to money market mutual funds through the overnight reverse repurchase arrangement. They also park cash at the Fed. It's between those two rates called administered rates. They're really dictated by the Fed. That's what they now call the midpoint, the Fed funds rate. But the federal funds rate was the legacy. It used to be in Paul Volcker's day that the way you impacted interest rates was just to tweak the Fed's rather small portfolio of treasuries, because then the Fed could induce a bank, instead of making a loan and having a multiplier effect, mm-hmm. the bank would just say, oh, if the Fed's selling more treasuries, then the price goes down, which means the yield goes up. So I'll do that instead of making a loan. I can get a pretty good return doing that. Well, those days are long gone. After 2008, part of the emergency package delivered by Congress that fall, as we were heading into the financial collapse, was to allow the Fed to pay interest on reserves. And the idea was that the Fed was also going to engage in quantitative easing. And some people thought that will create potentially hyperinflation. And then there was an interview with Bernanke, and he said, no, that's not a threat because we can raise interest rates in 15 minutes. What he meant was, by raising the interest we pay on reserves, which we can do in a heartbeat, we will get banks to stop lending, and that will shut down economic growth, and that will fight inflation. Well, now it's been a long time since that emergency, but meantime, that way of running management of interest rates by the Federal Reserve has become their primary mechanism. That is their main tool for choreographing interest rates.
Again, kind of back to this idea of not even necessarily just this centrally planned price of money, but also the centrally planned issuance of more currency through easing, through all of these different programs. Is there any evidence to point to that a central bank knows better how to set interest rates or money supply than the free market does?
Well, what kind of evidence? Because now we all have central banks, so we're going against a hypothetical. Mm-hmm. But I find it interesting to have these very serious discussions among monetary officials about what's the neutral rate. And it's almost mythological. No one knows mm-hmm. the neutral rate. But to me, that would come very close to being the market determined rate. So instead of chasing the elusive real rate, why not just let demand and supply forces determine the price of loanable capital? Because it's the people in the economy, those organic forces, who I think are much better judges. And the reason I often will invoke how things worked under prior monetary systems, particularly the classical international gold standard, or under the Bretton Woods, where the dollar gold convertible system was in place to regulate money, is because I think it helps us understand that when you have some kind of anchor, then you allow free forces to determine the appropriate level of money and credit that needs to be available to the economy. And when you have the Federal Reserve saying, we know better, so we're going to ratchet up or ratchet down, I think that the reason those prior systems worked is if someone at the margin said, I think things are getting too loosey-goosey, I think people have too much irrational exuberance, that person at the margin could turn in currency for gold and by that action reduce the money supply. So the money supply was really determined by the people operating in the economy, who I think are the better judges. Those millions, their aggregate expectations about where the economy's headed, to me, are more valuable than any conversation around the board table at the Federal Reserve in Washington.
You know, the last guest of the show, him and I discussed this example, so it's very fresh on my mind. But this example of, let's say, just the food system within Manhattan, right? Let's say they feed somewhere in around 5 million people per day. Every one of those transactions happens without the Fed's, direct oversight or intervention. Food is delivered, food is paid for, food is picked up. And, that I think is a great example of really this idea of how the actual market supplies and prices goods within it. And there is no way you can have any type of governing body to account for and properly identify even all of those transactions. So my question would be to you is, what do you think of the quality of the data that the Fed gets at this point? We've seen so much of this verbiage from the Fed of being so data dependent. So when they say that they're so data dependent, we have to assume that the quality of their data is of absolute, golden quality.
I think we're seeing that the quality of the data is not so great. A lot of it's based on surveys, and some companies and individuals are becoming reluctant to respond to those surveys. So you're already getting distortions. We've had a lot of illegal immigration. I'm not sure people want to exactly volunteer who they're hiring. There's concerns about whether people are documented or have legitimate work visas. And all I'm saying is when you see gaps between, say, a payroll number and then the household survey, I think it could be because people who can qualify for uninsurance for unemployment insurance are not undocumented aliens or people who were part of the workforce, so they qualify. And so I think we get this different treatment where we try to match up those figures and we don't have a comprehensive idea of the level of employment. So the problem is when you're data driven, as the Fed says, trying to make it sound like a virtuous aspect of how they calibrate money and credit, when the data is dubious, it doesn't seem like such a smart policy. And we would be better off having a framework. And that's why I lean toward more of a rules-based approach. It would be more forward-looking and saying this is what we do under these parameters versus trying to kind of do it ad hoc and saying, oh, this just came in. And we saw what happened after their July decision where they held pat. Labor numbers seemed to suddenly drop off. And people were saying they should even have an intra-meeting decision to suddenly cut rates, only to have in September a decision after going 8 straight meetings at the highest interest rate in 22 years. Then they suddenly drop 50 basis points, a very aggressive move by the Federal Reserve. And at the press conference following the communique saying we're cutting 50 basis points, Chair Powell said, no, it's not because there's a problem with labor. It's solid. No, it's not because of growth. It's good. So why do something that by the Fed's own model, which unless they're disavowing it, they wouldn't be doing that. They hadn't hit their inflation target. So that was another thing they wanted to avoid is we sure don't want to cut down to close to 2% and then have it go back up. And yet they do this aggressive move to cut. I think it shows, especially since we've now seen stronger labor numbers and an uptick in the consumer price index, it made the Fed's move look unwarranted and even silly, as if they had panicked. And maybe it was caused by data that wasn't consistent. Maybe it was caused by problems in gathering the data or putting it together. We see revisions that swamp the justification for prior monetary policy decisions. And to go to your point about, wouldn't it be better to just let market forces, just like people getting fed in New York, let individuals seek their own well-being? I mean, that's Adam Smith's invisible hand. That is what works. People doing well by doing good for themselves in seeking to improve their own fortunes and improve their prospects for prosperity, they end up benefiting all of society. There's a great essay, a classic essay called "I Pencil," and it's kind of a monologue, as if an inanimate object, a pencil, is explaining how it came into being, and it's really rather marvelous. But it was not accomplished through any kind of government mandate or any kind of industrial policy. It was done by recognizing a need and filling it through the ingenious entrepreneurship of all of the individuals who came together to produce something so useful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great essay. And it's very, very eye-opening to understand something as simple as a pencil and how it gets built. So, Dr. Shelton, I'd like to kind of move out, let's say, a little bit more of a macro view, like a zoomed out idea, because when we have a central bank working within its own country, that's one thing. But when we have a combination of different central banks setting their own prices of money, setting their own, let's say, expansions or contractions of the currency supply, how can a global financial crisis be triggered when these different central banks are out of phase in their interest rate or stimulus cycles?
Tom, I'd call me Judy, please. But I really love your questions, and either we're thinking alike, or I flatter myself and think you read the book, because those are some very
absolutely did.
That's a major aspect of my concern. Mm-hmm. Under the Bretton Woods International Monetary System, going back to 44 and then the next 25 years after that, countries had to have fixed exchange rates, and it was all anchored by the gold convertible dollar. But you had that level monetary playing field. Now we have currency manipulation. And when you have currency manipulation, the traditional response has always been tariffs. Mm-hmm. That was the reason we put in Bretton Woods, so that we wouldn't repeat what happened in the 30s, where you had beggar thy neighbor policies, where countries would devalue their currencies to gain an unfair trade advantage in their exports. And then the other country receiving it would retaliate with tariffs. So you wanted to end that cycle. And what happens now is that currency manipulation is carried out through the divergent monetary policies of the world's major central banks. Why does the U.S., our target interest rate from a country you would think would have a pretty good credit reputation, it's now at 4.9%. The comparable rate for the European Central Bank is 3.65. So
which they're just talking about lowering today as well.
Which they're just talking about lowering at a time when our own Federal Reserve is now saying maybe we shouldn't have cut so much. And you're hearing various officials saying they're going to be more cautious going forward because they don't want to reignite inflation. So yes, exactly that. We see other major central banks talking about lowering interest rates, which will show up pretty fast in the value of their currencies relative to the dollar. So that makes it easier for them to export. And again, through no fault of their own, our own producers and manufacturers are put at a competitive disadvantage because we do not have a rational international monetary system to prevent these currency wars. They're subtle, but that's what they are, being conducted through central banks. And the banks will always say, well, we're doing what makes sense for our own economies. But they know full well, and sometimes often admit, that gaining an export advantage is part of the justification for their interest rate policy.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's often been, let's say, kind of talked about in some of these circles that the new BRICS alliance would use let's say, a benchmark of quantity of gold to use as an exchange rate between each other's currencies. Is that really the ideal answer here, to make a stable and benchmark exchange rate to be able to facilitate this type of cross-border transactional use?
I think gold can play a role in a I'll say an international monetary system. Mm. The countries who participate in BRICS are not necessarily our friends. Mm-hmm. And when they talk about setting up a rival system with a link to gold, I think we need to pay attention to that. But I would certainly hope that it would be the United States initiating monetary reform to preserve an open global marketplace, to make free trade based on the principles that justified it in Adam Smith's day, which is that you had an international monetary system where everyone used the same reserve asset as the benchmark, so that money values translated across borders in a coherent way. And I hope the U.S., as you know from the book, I'm suggesting that we initiate a long-term treasury bond that would be convertible into gold at maturity by bondholders. I would then like to see other countries do the same. Mm-hmm. You have other major gold holders: Germany, Italy, France. The European Central Bank has significant gold reserves. The U.S. has the highest level of gold reserves. And I think it would be a way for the U.S. to say, if we're issuing a sovereign debt security, ultimately convertible into gold, and other countries also issue sovereign debt securities, ultimately convertible into gold, even if maturity is 30 years out or more, you're talking about the beginning of a new international monetary system with essentially fixed rates, because the price of those securities would be converging toward the same payout, that is gold, and they would be priced in the currencies of the issuing countries. So now you have the beginning of a fixed rate system, because you can see what it would cost you to have that security issued by one country versus another. So now the interest rate should reflect the credibility of the promise to deliver. But this could become a marker for the United States to say, we're going to get our fiscal house in order. We're going to start delivering sound finances, sound money, and all we have to do is better than people expect. And they might prefer to have dollars in the future, but they have the right to convert to gold. So I think that gets to the heart of the book, the reason for the title. Why shouldn't the dollar be as good as gold? For a long time, it was. Why should we accept that it will be worth less in the future? But I think an important aspect would be, by monitoring the relative value people place on one country's gold convertible claim versus another, you are starting to make those countries accountable for their own performance of how their currency is relative to gold. So now we're all trying to have currency evolve to a steady, stable relationship to this common reserve asset or benchmark. It doesn't have to be gold, because I know how quickly, and I think you do too, people will say, oh, no, that makes you a retrograde, a throwback. It doesn't have to be gold, but why not gold? It already is held by central banks around the world. It is widely, broadly seen as a surrogate for real money. It's held by individuals. It has industrial value. Why not use gold? It's a natural benchmark for getting to a situation where money translates across borders in a meaningful way and doesn't put producers domestically at a disadvantage because the central bank did something or the government didn't perform to ensure a level monetary playing field.
I'd like to dig in a little bit to the specifics of how the U.S. could maybe take the lead in the world in in some ways bringing back the idea of a little bit of a gold standard, or at least, let's say, a gold redeemable treasury or bond. Would you put that out on, all portions of the yield curve? What would that look like to you?
What I'm imagining is, well, I'll start with a great commercial. This was a campaign commercial done by Ronald Reagan when he was first running for president. And he said, business doesn't cause inflation, labor doesn't cause inflation, government does. And he said, we must restore some form of gold backing to the dollar to get a grip on inflation. And he said, my first priority as president will be to make the US dollar the most trusted currency in the world. What I'm talking about is some form of gold backing. I would like, for the first time in 53 years, to have an official link between the dollar and gold. I'm going back to when Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system in August of 71. We've been carrying the gold we had at that point at a value of $42 an ounce ever since. If you look at the books at the Treasury or the Federal Reserve, our total hoard, the largest in the world, of 261 million ounces, is valued at $11 million. That's the statutory rate at the time. We're carrying that at that book value. We know at the current price of gold, there's a windfall gain there of over $700 billion. I would like to see the US Treasury issue a long-term bond. It could be as far out as 50 years. When I was on the transition team for the incoming Trump administration, I was assigned to Treasury as a lead advisor on international economic affairs. And it was talked about a 50-year bond. France has 50-year bonds. It's not unusual. It could happen. Mm-hmm. A 50-year bond, if the U.S. were to put it out in, say, on July 4th, 2026, have it mature on July 4th, 2076, that would be our 300th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. First off, I think people need to feel that the U.S. is confident we'll still be here in 50 years. We'll still be standing tall, and we will have made progress against this existential threat of fiscal unsustainability. I want this 50-year gold convertible bond, and the mechanics would be, I could put it this way: what would you pay today to have an ounce of gold? And someone might say, oh, well, I would pay $2,700 for an ounce of gold today because that's the market price. Mm-hmm. Well, what would you pay today to be able to buy gold in 50 years for $2,700? It's almost laughable. Everyone would say, well, it's going to cost twice that much or more. Mm-hmm. So, of course, that's worth something to have a gold future, the right to buy it. That, again, brings up this issue. Why isn't the dollar as good as gold? Because that makes it very stark. People naturally assume the gold will hold its value, but not the dollar. So I'm suggesting that if the U.S. collateralizes, uses maybe all of that 261 million, maybe some percentage, and says we're going to warehouse this, we're going to audit it, and this can only be used to pay out this obligation, I think that becomes an important signaling device. For one thing, if you compare the yield on, say, a 30-year treasury with the implicit yield of this, I'll call them treasury trust bonds, gold convertible bonds, let's say the gap was so great because people paid a premium. People are willing to lend to the government long term. We know that. But to have sort of this additional option of a call option on gold, if you will, or to say it's attached to a gold future, you bundled it, not just a treasury security, but a gold futures contract. If the gap was huge, which I think says something about the credibility of the dollar going forward, maybe they don't even think the Fed will hit the 2% target regularly going into the future, that could become a price rule. That could become, just for the Federal Reserve's point of view, a signal that they have to raise rates, or the signal that they must deal with this these aggregate expectations about the future value of the dollar. And so at the very least, it's a signaling device and potentially a price rule for the Federal Reserve. But I think much more importantly, you could do this you could do a pilot program 5 years out, 10 years out. You might want to go up and down the yield curve, as you said. You might want to go and apportion some of your gold holdings to pay out in accordance with shorter terms. But I like the idea of ultimately a 50-year bond, because I think it's really important to say we're getting on a serious path to deal with this existential threat of unbalanced budgets going into the future. I saw that's what ultimately bankrupted the Soviet Union. When I first started studying that on a postdoctoral fellowship at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, it was just to look at the internal condition and to assess the impact of Western capital on the Soviet economy. Mm-hmm. And what ended up being I thought would be a dry study, turned into saying that country's going bankrupt. And it seemed impossible to suggest that it could ever collapse, but I didn't see any other conclusion. So my book ended up with this sensationalist title. Even the Hoover Institution said, we're not going to have it be the impact of Western capital on the Soviet economy. We're calling it the coming Soviet crash. Mm-hmm. And that came out in January of 89. By December of 91, the country was dissolved. So it can happen. Countries can go bankrupt, even countries with mass weapons and powerful resources or access to powerful resources of their own. So I do think it's a real threat. And that would be the idea of having this Treasury initiative. And I think it should appeal to an incoming president to sort of fulfill what Reagan suggested, to correct what happened under President Nixon. Nixon, when he ended the Bretton Woods system, said we need a new international monetary system, and we're going to get right on it. But having no monetary system turned out to be the new system. Mm-hmm. So I think there could be great appeal in doing it. And if there's huge demand for these Treasury trust bonds, which I think there would be, I think they would sell at a tremendous premium. So a very cheap source of financing for the government over and above, however you could capture that windfall gain in the value of the gold. Because otherwise, are we going to just let it sit doing nothing for another 53 years? I agree, our gold holdings are the family jewels, but I see this as a family emergency for the United States. We are really looking at I'm tired of the word unsustainable. It's a disastrous fiscal outlook. And we could see our credit rating downgraded. That could be quite serious, whether or not we would ever default. So I think we have to deal with this problem. And so that's what I'm recommending. And if in the private sector, if they see great demand, why wouldn't private money market funds, hedge funds, bundle together traditional Treasury securities, long-term, at least 30-year, with gold futures? Why wouldn't a new market for gold futures develop? Mm-hmm. And then you could magnify the impact of all this by saying, we're going to give you the same payout. You're going to be looking at the equivalent of a traditional Treasury debt offering, but we've now put it together, combine it with a gold futures contract so that we can compete against these Treasury trust bonds. And so I think that could help magnify the impact of starting to make currency behave, U.S. currency, in a more stable way relative to the price of gold. And so that's what I'm seeking. But I think it has to start somewhere. I don't think you can seriously say, let's go to a gold standard tomorrow. For one thing, we have 2.4 trillion in just Federal Reserve notes, just paper currency, most of it, 70% of it circulating outside our country. So even at a 700 billion, you can't begin to cover just the paper claims. That's not what I'm proposing. Mm-hmm. I'm saying establish a beachhead to say we do want to reintroduce discipline. Gold has traditionally had that ability to have a regulating internal discipline because people have the right to convert currency into gold. Let's reintroduce that, and let's hope people pay a lot of attention and start comparing yields. And maybe they end up buying this as a savings bond for their grandchildren. I won't define in advance all the details, the maturities, or the parameters of the instrument, but it's the beginning. The real news would be that the U.S. Treasury, the news for Americans as well as the world, is going to have a dollar debt instrument that ultimately is convertible into gold. That's powerful.
Absolutely. And, that was really well said about how you really framed the problems, this existential problem that we're facing. But, Judy, as we think about the role of gold throughout history, we've always moved away from it. So what do you think is the importance of leadership here to adhering to a ballast or some type of system that restrains government spending over time?
Well, when you talk about moving away from it, right? I mean, even when gold was the currency, the solidus coin from the 4th to the 11th century, ultimately what happens is governments want to take over the money business, and they clip coins. They start clipping some small fragment. That to me is very comparable to having a target inflation rate of 2%. It's clipping the value of the money unit, and that allows government to overspend. My best hope for getting the budget under control is economic growth that would be released through the economic agenda being proposed by President Trump, which is a classic supply side agenda, very comparable to what happened under President Reagan, very close to what my mentor, Robert Mundell, advocated. He wanted stable money and low taxation rates. He thinks that's the magic formula. And he won the Nobel Prize ultimately. So that's the formula I think works. But we clearly, even when we see revenues coming in higher, I think because of the cut in taxation that happened under the Trump administration, we see spending exceeding the revenues. Mm-hmm. So I see the idea of Elon Musk coming in and being in charge of what he's called the Department of Government Efficiency, or chief cost cutter, very positively. I think we have too many layers of government bureaucrats, well-meaning people, but I just don't think that's how you efficiently deliver government services. I would like to see a reduction in the size of government. I will always put more faith in the private sector to come up with innovative solutions. And a very good example would be billions were allocated to providing rural internet. Well, I live in rural Virginia, and it wasn't until I got my Starlink system, which is how we're having the interview, courtesy of buying from Elon Musk this product and signing up for it. And we see how now they have many Starlink systems available in Europe, where I just came from, and elsewhere all over the world. So I think that solutions come up to the private sector through innovative entrepreneurs, and I want to unleash that kind of energy. So I see that as a way to improve the economic outlook, and even to go to your question, as a way to cut spending. Let's get someone in there who knows how to substantially trim a workforce. I think X is functioning better than it did before in the Twitter days. And I understand, although it was harsh, there was a significant reduction in personnel. So that's where you start.
So are there any credible plans at this point, going into the election? We're less than 3 weeks out of the election here. Are there any credible plans for addressing the deficit, the exploding interest expense, anything like this?
Well, it's ironic on the exploding interest expense. I mean, that's just a travesty. When the government was borrowing so excessively during COVID, one rationale was, but rates are at near zero, so we can afford to do this. But now rates have been at a record high. They've just come down by 50 basis points. But the government wasn't at all deterred when rates went up. It didn't mean they reduced their deficit spending. It's a terrible situation now where the Fed is saying we're running restrictive monetary policy, but we have expansionary fiscal policy in peacetime when we have a good economy and strong labor numbers. So why are we running a deficit? I think that having a commission, and look, commissions in a way can be a cop-out. We have had commissions before to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. But I guess I just now take it more seriously if Elon Musk were doing that. And as far as reducing the cost of financing the debt, unless you're ready to impinge on the Fed and say you can't keep rates at this level, even though it massively impacted future budget statements, we just see it didn't curtail government spending. They just tack on the additional estimated cost of borrowing to finance the spending to those future budget numbers, which is why you see continuing deficits. I hope the Fed didn't cut to reduce the interest expense to government. They'll say they didn't. But if the Fed had the nerve to say to government, quit all the deficit spending, quit paying people not to work, then I think the Fed could say, and in exchange, we'll feel more comfortable reducing the interest rate. That's what happened under Greenspan. That's when Carville famously said he wanted to be reincarnated as a 10-year government bond because they had all the power. But the idea was we cannot bring down interest rates until you start to balance the budget, or at least seriously take on that challenge.
You know, so many of these ideas we've discussed today would make, or I'm sure really resonate with our audience, and they would really resonate, I think, with a lot of Americans. Your nomination for a seat in the Federal Reserve was ultimately denied, and I read a couple quotes that you were considered unfit for the post due to your extreme and ill-considered views. And in that rejection of your nomination, this was also needed for the Fed to maintain its nonpartisan approach. So how on earth do we get any meaningful change within this institution if, you know, radical views like trying to constrain government spending and being a leader in the world in terms of returning to some type of a sound and dependable currency are so wildly opposed like this?
Well, I will say I did come pretty close to making it. And a couple of senators on the Republican side who supported me could not vote because of COVID. Mm-hmm. But I was taken aback by the harshness of the criticism. But much of it...
Sorry to interrupt, but ill-considered opinion seems, you know, completely inaccurate considering you wrote an entire book on this.
Well, I appreciate your saying that. And I considered myself a monetary scholar, and I testified many times before Senate Banking, before House Financial Services, before the Joint Economic Committee. So it wasn't as if I didn't have knowledge and hadn't been called upon by government to give expert testimony on very important international monetary issues. I also thought that, well, I was grateful during my hearing. Senator Rounds gave me an opportunity to say what I really thought. And I was able to say that I believed government should look upon providing sound money as a moral contract, that citizens had a right, that they deserved sound money. So I would hope that anyone who would attain the chairmanship or serve as a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve would start from that sense that you owe it to the people to provide sound money.
Mhm.
and not to manage the economy and not to attribute to yourselves a decision. I won't say who, but a member of the Board of Governors said in the last couple of days, well, we're going to have to be cautious now on interest rates because the economic activity has not cooled down as much as desired. I just think that's perverse for the central bank to be trying on purpose to orchestrate a curtailing of economic growth or an increase in unemployment. So I think there are problems with the Fed's model. But at the height of the criticism that I experienced, I would see there was a particularly nasty column in the Washington Post that called me a gold bug and said, this is a dog whistle to the fringe crowd to say things like sound money. And I thought, really? That's a fringe idea? I think that's a pretty American founding fathers' idea of the role of money. It was meant to be a dependable tool for people who pursued economic liberty, and just a basic responsibility of government to ensure that money did function as a reliable measure and store of value and meaningful unit of account. But the morning I saw that very disrespectful article, not just of me, but of anyone who thought sound money was a worthy pursuit and a virtue of our country, should be. I'd long become colleagues with Alan Greenspan. So I emailed him, and my email, I said, there seems to be a hysterical antagonism against the gold standard. Those were his opening words in an essay he wrote in the 60s called Gold and Economic Freedom. Now, that's a radical essay where he said people against the gold standard are for redistribution of income. They believe in statist government, that government can expropriate wealth from its citizens. And he wrote back shortly, he said, if gold is such a worthless metal, why does the United States government and all major governments hold so much of it? Mm-hmm. And I thought, I guess I can take the harsh punditry because I know people like Greenspan who have been in the arena, Paul Volcker, another great colleague who I'd known for decades, and every year would attend Robert Mundell's International Monetary Seminar in Siena, Italy, and usually sit with Paul. These people talk about gold easily. They understand it's a bulwark for monetary credibility. And one thing about Paul Volcker, he even said in his last book, which was called Keeping at It, The Quest for Sound Money and Good Government. He said, I have never understood the economic or moral logic for deliberately debasing the money. He said, even if it's 2 or 3% a year, that's still inflation. He said, my mother would see through that. So he saw it as an obvious scam. And so the people I truly respect were on the same page. And we could talk about gold historically, how it could have a new role. Greenspan in 1981 talked about treasury bonds backed by gold. So I think it's about time that we address this as an honest issue that academics and scholars should be able to rationally discuss, because now we're saying, all right, you don't like using gold compared to what? 9% inflation? We had that. Mm-hmm. Where do we get accountability? From our own central bank. We had 2008. We had a total financial collapse. If the goal of having a Federal Reserve was to avoid that, then why wasn't it the Fed's fault? I don't know any other institution that had more responsibility for properly calibrating the amount of money and credit out there. And yet we had that happen. And that was as bad as anything that happened during the Great Depression. And Bernanke will say so. So that's what I'm talking about. Let's be open-minded to considering what has worked in the past. Let's go back to the future. Let's let it work for alternative currencies, maybe for stable coins, I'm open to the crypto community. I think people have every right to say we need decentralized finance because this current system does play favorites. And to some extent, it's justified to say that monetary policy seems rigged toward people who are already wealthy. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to address those issues. And the fact that there's now so much interest in gold, and we see it flying off the shelves at Costco, tells us something, that there's a collective yearning for money you can trust and money you can use to plan your life because it's going to hold its value. That I think this is a discussion the country deserves to have. And I don't think that our monetary officials should be oblivious to it. I think they should embrace it.
Mm-hmm. Well, Judy, I really appreciate you doing your part to help, kind of as Paul Volcker said, help educate some of these mothers, everybody in society to be able to understand this issue and the importance of it by, taking the time to speak with me today, and also by writing the book. That title again, Good as Gold, How to Unleash the Power of Sound Money. I understand it's doing quite well already in its first week.
I looked today. I think I said I'm on a different time zone from traveling at about 2 a.m. And I saw that it was the number one release, the hardcover, the Kindle, the audio in 3 categories: mm-hmm. monetary policy and money, economic policy, and then there's another one called economic policy and development. Who knows? Maybe that'll last for a moment. But it was gratifying to see it. The royalties will go to the Independent Institute. I'm a senior fellow there, and I greatly respect them as a think tank. But I see it as more a sign that people are prepared to maybe get a little radical and start demanding sound money. I think as American citizens, we have every right.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing to me that the idea of sound money is considered radical in this day and age, but I guess we shouldn't be surprised by anything anymore. Judy, is there anything that you'd like to leave our listeners to think about before we wrap up today?
Well, let's get radical. I don't think it's too much to ask. And I think our economy would do a lot better if we had less central planning by a government agency, even an independent government agency, and more of a organic approach, or at least with some aspect of discipline. And I want the U.S. to be the leader in reestablishing this, because really all over the world, and I was in India as well, countries are looking to the United States for leadership. Governments are taking up all the oxygen in the room. They're borrowing all the money and redistributing it. And I think that's really taking away from the individual liberty, the economic liberty of people who would like to produce prosperity because they're willing to take on risk, and other people are willing to save. And it's that seed corn of people's savings, people who say, I'll sacrifice and not consume today, I'll invest in the future, that leads to that greater harvest that really raises standards of living mm-hmm. for whole nations. And I think peace and prosperity, that's the message, but let's start with honest money.
Absolutely. Again, the book is available everywhere, and as well as you're an excellent Twitter follow at Judy SHEL, at Judy SHEL. Dr. Shelton, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
I loved our discussion and appreciate it so much, Tom. Thank you.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only. Nothing on this podcast should be taken as investment advice. Guests on this show are not compensated for their appearance. Listeners are urged to educate themselves and make their own decisions. Do not base any investment decisions on the information contained. To view our full disclaimer, please visit our website.